Before there was a Santa Clarita or even a canyon country, there were places in the eastern Santa Clarita Valley with names like Lang, and Ravenna, Sulphur Springs. Tiny mining towns of one sort or another, where men worked long hours to pull enough minerals out of the hills to put food on the table for their pioneering families. I'm Leon Warden, and this is Legacy, Santa Clarita's Living History. Brought to you by the Santa Clarita Valley Historical Society, the SCV School and Business Alliance, and Valencia Bank and Trust. There were only a couple of thousand people living in the entire Santa Clarita Valley 75 years ago, and tonight's guest was one of them. I'd like to welcome Dick Held to the show.
Hi.
Thank you for being here, Dick. You were really young when you were growing up in Agua Dulce during the Depression. Did you feel deprived?
Not at all. I might have had I known any better, but living here at the time without any highways, we saw very little of the outside world.
It was quite a different place, judging from a couple of these photos that you brought. What can you tell us about this one here?
This photo shows three of the pioneer women here. My mother is the one in the center, and the ones on either side are Rita Schaefer and Clara Wright. The reason for the three children is that those three women were close friends, and they didn't want to raise a lone child out in this country where he would not have a friend to grow up with and play with. So they agreed to become pregnant at the same time. And as it turned out, I was about a year slow. So in the picture, you'll notice that the baby in the middle is about a year younger than the other two. But we managed to get together and have great times together for a good many years.
Now this one here is really quite interesting. You are one of these kids. Which one are you?
Well, I'm the larger one.
Okay.
That's my brother. He was born just a little over a year after I was born.
What's going on there in the background with the car?
We're eating two apples that some new neighbors gave us one afternoon when we dropped around to visit, and they've just finished drilling a well there. And right behind my brother and I is the wellhead and the pump. You can see that in those days they didn't have electric lines and they didn't have electric motors, so for power they used the closest Model T Ford. They took that Model T Ford, backed it up to the well, jacked up one wheel, and the belt is wrapped around that wheel and then wrapped around the pulley on the pump. They start up the engine and the pump takes off and the water flow. And you can see the stream of water just pouring out that large 6-inch pipe there.
Now this was a regular practice? People used their jitneys for this?
We used to see that quite frequently. Frequently, yes. Wasn't the best thing in the world for the differential on the car, but it was definitely the easiest way to make a water pump operate in this valley in those days.
Now, before you were born, your mother, Geneva Dean, she was a school teacher, I understand?
Yes, she, for some reason, my mother preferred to teach in mining camps. Shortly after she graduated from Stanford, she went over to Morenci, Arizona, and taught in a tiny town of Clifton. And she used to tell me that Clifton was so far out in the woods that there wasn't, or out in the desert, that there wasn't even a road there. You couldn't go there by wagon. She had to ride in on horseback to the school. And
now she came out to what today is Canyon Country and taught at Sulphur Springs?
Again, she taught in a mining school at Sulphur Springs.
Now this is about 1918, around in there?
It was, as nearly as I can tell, it was either 1918 or 1919 when she started at the Sulphur Springs School. Yes.
About how many kids were in the school at that time?
It seems to me, she told me that one year there were 18 or 19, and in fact that was the year that the mine closed. And the mine closed that year shortly after school started, and she said that most all of the miners and their families moved out. They left her with just one student who she became quite close to because she taught that one student for a whole year almost as a private student.
Now this mine, your dad worked at the mine, but it wasn't a gold or silver mine, was it?
No, it was Borax there. His brothers had been coal miners in Illinois, and in fact that's the reason they moved out here. They were 20 years older than he was, and when my father was born, they decided that their little brother wasn't going to become a coal miner, so they moved out here and homesteaded in Agua Dulce Canyon.
What did they use borax for back then?
I know of the two main uses at that time, or two uses that I was told of, was soap, and it was also used as a flux in certain metal purification and joining processes.
Like for making steel? And
yes, and it was used, and as I understand it, it was used to keep the oxygen out of the separate the oxygen from the metal.
Right. Now that Sterling Borax mine, I guess it was opened in about 1908 and it closed in early 20s, right?
I think it was either 1922 or 1923 that it closed.
What did your dad do after the mine closed?
Well, he really had to scramble around to find a way to support Mom because they got married just about the time the mine closed. He worked in Los Angeles for a while for one of the pump companies, Lane and Bowler Pump Company, and then he was hired by the Los Angeles County as a member of one of the Los Angeles County survey parties.
And when they moved out to Agua Dulce, did they have any neighbors out there then?
Yes, mostly Helds. My uncle lived just
Lots
over.
of relatives out there.
My uncle lived just over the hill. One uncle lived just over the hill behind our house. My grandmother lived just down the valley. Uncle Charlie was the next one down the valley, and the furthest house down was Uncle Ott's. And then came what we used to call the Company Ranch, which was one of the largest ranches and was on the most fertile piece of property, I believe, in the valley. And then, of course, over in the Mid Canyon area, Clara Wright taught the grammar school in Mid Canyon. And she was a good friend of my mother's. And my mother, while she was teaching the Sulphur Springs School, had been boarding with Walter and Minnie Murphy, who were residing in the old original Mitchell Ranch House. And then there was the Schaefer family that was down there close, and just a few miles, or just a mile or two above our house in Agua Dulce Canyon, there was the Johnson family. I remember some other names like the Hyatts, and of course Wes Mitchell, who lived down in Soledad. And
now your mom, after she taught at Sulphur Springs, she taught at Agua Dulce Grammar School, right?
Yes, in 1930, the county began to cut back on their employees because of the Depression, and it was approximately 1930 it was approximately 1930 that my father was let go as a surveyor, and Mother had an opportunity to teach the school there in 1930 and 1931, and so she became the sole source of income those 2 years.
Really? Well, let's take a look. You went out to some of these places in Agua Dulce that you're talking about with our local historian, Joellen Rismachi.
Yes.
Let's take a look at that right now.
We're on Agua Dulce Canyon Road in front of an old church with Dick Held. Dick, what can you tell us about this church?
This wasn't always a church. In 1930, it was the Agua Dulce Grammar School. My mother was hired that year to teach, and there was approximately 28 to 30 students. All 8 grades were included. She would bring me and place me in the front row where she could supervise very carefully because there were not babysitters available in the area. There's an old windmill out behind the church, which looks like the same one that was there when it was a grammar school. And that windmill supplied water for the drinking water and for the students' needs. I can remember when the classes were released, all the students rushed out and lined up in front of the drinking fountain, got their drink of water, and then they usually started a baseball game. My mother pitched for the game because there weren't enough students available to make up two teams. She was also a very, very good athlete, so she had enough control to pitch without hitting the student unless she wanted to.
We're on Darling Road, and we've stopped in front of an old house. Dick, what can you tell us about this house?
This is the house my father built. This is a picture of the house as it looked in 1930. My father built this house starting in 1920 or 21 with rocks that he carried home from his job at the Borax mine. He worked in the Borax mine and crossed a small creek that was filled with rocks, and he would carry as many as the car would hold every night on his way home. When he brought me home from the hospital in 1926, it became apparent that it was going to have to serve as a house rather than a garage, and he filled in the two garage doors at the north end and put in a partition in the house that converted it into a living room, a bedroom, and a very small kitchen. The sleeping porch was built where you see the large window now, and that was screened in with a canvas awning that could be rolled up and down to protect us from the sun or the wind in the summertime. And we slept there as often as we could, but sometimes in the winter when it snowed, we did have to move back in the house. We spent many happy years in that house, and it seemed quite large at the time, but we finally moved away in 1932. This was our old cool house. My father and my mother used to store beer for themselves and root beer for my brother and I in here. Of course, it was home brewed because this was during Prohibition. It did not always stay cool in here, so during the summertime, the beer bottles and the root beer bottles would explode, sending flying glass all over. When my brother and I were sent out to bring in either a bottle of beer or a bottle of root beer, we were always told to wrap a gunny sack around it and carry it into the house wrapped in a gunny sack to prevent anyone from being injured by flying glass.
We're on our way back to Canyon Country, and we've stopped here on Davenport Road. Dick, what can you tell us about this place?
Behind us, you can see the site of the old Borax mine. It operated in the early 1900s at this location on the west slope of Saddleback Mountain. My father and his three brothers all worked there, and many of the other men from this area also were working in that mine. Below us, you can see the location of the old train line going down to the old narrow gauge line that ran down to the main line at Lang. Dad used to, as an engineer, used to run that train down daily to Lang, pick up the supplies, and bring them back up to the mine. In the early 1920s, probably about 1921, the mine finally closed, and most of the miners were left without any work or any means of support. And a lot of them had to move out, leaving towns like Lang and Sulphur Springs as virtual ghost towns.
For Legacy, I'm Joellen Rismanchi.
Now, when your dad was working at the mine back in 1918, 1919, did he live in that little mining camp that was just south of Davenport?
No, he wasn't there. He and two of his brothers, and for a time all three of the brothers, lived in my grandmother's house, and they all worked at the mine there. And so every evening they all went home on their own.
Mm-hmm. Now, this was, what kind of mining was this? I mean, was it hard rock mining? Was it like plastering? What'd they do?
Well, as my father described it, it was much like hard rock mining, although obviously the borax wasn't as hard as granite or some of the quartz that gold was usually in. But the holes were all, for blasting, were all hand drilled two men swinging what they called two-man jacks, which is a sledgehammer with an extra long handle. One stood on either side of a third man who held the drill in place. It was a long star drill. I don't know just how long they got them, or they had them, but it must have been at least long enough to reach in as far as they wanted to place the dynamite. But we had some of the old star drills laying around the ranch for years afterwards, and the ones that I saw were about 4 feet long, about 1.5 inches in diameter. And these were used to drill holes, and the dynamite was then slipped in the hole and the blast set off. And then everything was cleaned up afterwards. It was an underground, as it was described to me, it was an underground operation, and all the mining was done in these small and relatively narrow tunnels underground.
Right. I understand you have some stories about when there were a lot of cattle out in the area. There was something about cows and white lines.
Oh, well, one day Dad and one of the neighbors just took a small herd of cattle, about 20 cattle, up north of what is now called the Sierra Highway, into the hills there, and left them for 2 or 3 weeks to pasture out there. When the two cowmen felt that the cows had pretty much taken care of all the pasture available there, they went back to bring them home. We heard no more from my dad until very, very late that night. He arrived home still pretty upset and with a few curses of things.
Yeah.
It turned out that after they had driven the cattle up there, the county had come through and painted a white line right up the middle of the highway. When these cows were driven down, they'd come to the white line, and then just suddenly they'd rear back and slide to a stop short of the line and wouldn't cross it. And finally, Dad and his friend had to lasso every single one of those cows and drag them across forcibly, release them, and once they were across the line, they took off for home happily.
Now, I guess there was some affinity for cattle. Your mom had a bull for a watchdog? Or?
Yeah, she started out with a bulldog for a watchdog, and this bulldog had the usual bulldog's habit of chasing cars and trying to bite the tires. And he finally did that one time too many and was run over. And so Mom thought that she probably needed protection, so she started training a young bull that she had there to protect her, just as the bulldog had. And he learned that whenever Mom said sick 'em, he was to get whoever was in the neighborhood. And one day Mom and Dad were engaged in a little bit of horseplay out in the yard, and she thought it would be funny, and she said sick 'em. And that bull chased Dad around the house about 3 times, and Dad finally rushed in the door and slammed the door, and the bull continued to circle the house, stopping every once in a while to put his front hoofs up on the door, on the windowsill, and stare in and try to find out where Dad was. Mom was just about dying of laughter the whole time.
Dad didn't quite feel the same way. Now, you were pretty young during Prohibition.
Yes.
But did you ever hear any stories about bootleggers in the area?
Yes. Dad's favorite one was about the time my Uncle Charlie rented his chicken houses in back of his house out for storage to some people from Los Angeles. When they began to move the things in that they were going to store, it became pretty obvious that this wasn't just the usual type of equipment that was being stored out there. There was a large still, and they were storing the whiskey after it was distilled in the buildings there. And at one point, they refused to pay the rent, and so Charlie told him they would have to move out, and he was going to hold the still until such time as they paid up the back rent. Since Dad lived in a rock house, all rock, and with some small windows in it that overlooked the chicken house, he asked Dad to make sure that they didn't move the equipment out until they had paid the rent. And this one day, several men arrived with a truck and a couple of automobiles to haul the still out. Dad and a friend of his went over armed with .45s and took one of the men prisoner and told the rest of them to go on back down to Los Angeles and not to come back until they had the money. And they took the prisoner over into Dad's rock house and tied him to a chair. And while Dad and his friend went outside and engaged in rather loud target practice with those .45s. They were fanning the guns, firing very rapidly, and did this for a couple of hours until they thought they had this man inside pretty well scared. They turned him loose and told him to go home and tell their bosses to pay up. And he went rushing over the hill, and then all of it, there was one shot fired, and he came rushing back yelling, "Crazy woman over there, crazy woman over there, save me." And Dad had sent Mother over the hill to guard against someone coming up the highway and had forgotten to notify her when he released the prisoner. And so they took the prisoner back over the hill, told Mom to let him go, and he took off down the highway. When he got back to Los Angeles, obviously he contacted a few people because shortly the county sheriff or a deputy sheriff arrived, told Dad that he had orders to arrest him and take him down to jail. The sheriff had been a pretty good friend of Dad's over the years, and so finally they reached an agreement that the sheriff would allow Dad's friend to stay and take care of my mother so she wouldn't be alone out there, and while Dad went down and was incarcerated in the jail. The friend immediately contacted my Uncle Charlie, who came out the next morning to get Dad out of jail. When he got to the jail, the sheriff was there, and when he asked the sheriff where Dad was, the sheriff said, "That darn Tony held. Just because I forgot to lock the door, he walked out and went home." So Charlie started on up the highway, and he met Dad about halfway home and took him the rest of the way home. But by that time, the equipment had all been moved out. And so that was the last of that episode.
Tony Harnischfeger. He was the dam keeper at the St. Francis Dam in 1928. Of course, the dam broke. And March 12, 1928, water rushed down the canyon. About 450 people died.
Yes.
I understand that your dad had been at the dam shortly before it broke.
Yes. The survey party that Dad worked on was doing some surveys around the area, and they had one last shot to take one afternoon. It just required one man to climb up on the hill up above the dam and set up a sight, and they would sight on that with their transit from down below the dam. So all the rest of the party just kind of sat down and enjoyed themselves and relaxed while Dad climbed up there. He was the last hired and the low man on the totem pole, so he climbed up and set up the sight, and they took the shot. But by that, it had taken him much longer to get up than he thought it would, and by that time it was getting dark, and so he started down and couldn't see very well, and finally reached the dam itself and thought that at least he could see to walk out on the dam. So he walked out on the dam and began to yell as loud as he could. And the dam keeper heard him and came out with a lantern and climbed as Dad told it, a very rickety set of wooden stairs going up the face of the dam. When he got up the top, he started down with Dad and a light to show them the way, and Dad said that at the time there were just sheets of water shooting out 20 or 30 feet on all sides of the ladder. They were thoroughly drenched the whole time when they went down. And then about 2 weeks later, the dam...
That was 2 weeks, huh? 2 weeks before the dam broke.
Yep.
Fascinating. A few years later, I guess you were old enough to remember some filming out at Vasquez Rocks, kind of in your backyard.
Yes. One evening, after dinner, Dad thought it would be interesting to go out and watch one of the films that was being made out there, and so he packed Mother and my brother and I in the car, and we drove out over by what's now the main entrance to Vasquez Rocks, and around that rock and down somewhat further, and then got out and walked over to the edge of, as I remember it, a fairly deep draw or canyon, and around the rim of the canyon there were a whole circle of large arc lights. They were being used as floodlights to illuminate the area down below. And the scene that was being filmed was of a horse being ridden off of either a cliff or a large rock. I can't remember everything because it's so long ago, but I remember very vividly that horse going off and landing in a large pond below. With the horse and rider went off and landed in a large pond below, and then swam ashore. And that's the only scene I remember.
Actually, I've seen that pond in movies. In fact, we have a clip from a 1935 film. If you'd like to take a look at now, it's out at Vasquez Rocks.
There'll be blood a-running in town before night. There'll be guns a-blazing and singing with lead. Tonight you'll be drinking your drink with the dead.
That's right. That's John Wayne riding and singing through Vasquez Rocks, the original singing cowboy. Back before Gene Autry. You ever see John Wayne out there at the rocks?
Not that I remember. Tom Mix, I don't actually remember seeing Tom Mix, but my father used to tell me when he was filming, and tell me that on occasion Tom Mix had pastured his horses in our pasture while the movie was being shot. But that's certainly a very familiar scene there.
Yeah. Singing Sandy, John Wayne, days before Gene Autry. We could go on all night, but I'm afraid we're out of time.
Oh, well, that's...
And so I'd like to thank you for being on the show. And I'd like to remind everybody that for all your SCV history needs, go to scvhistory.com on the internet, and you can see some more photos related to tonight's show on the internet at scvhistory.com. Visit the Saugus train station in downtown Newhall Saturdays and Sundays 1 to 4. Thank you for joining us. This is Legacy, Santa Clarita's Living History. I'm Leon Worden. Good night.